My name is Suzanne Clary. I'm the president of the J. Heritage Center, and you are at a very unique place that values scholarship. We value, education, people being inquisitive, like the speaker that you're going to hear tonight. We want more to inspire the future historians, whether it's a future Joseph Ellis or an Annette Gordon-Reed. And the idea is that that can happen here on this campus. It's a 23-acre park, but we treat it like it's a 23-acre indoor and outdoor laboratory and innovation place. And this would not be possible without many of you in this room, and particularly the O'Neill family and their friends who established the inaugural Margaret Nolan O'Neill Fellowship for American History. We are not just about scholarship, we are about civic responsibility and civil discourse and dialogue about many different topics that not just an exploration of the past and our history, but also about our future and the evolution of our democracy. And that's what this scholarship is about. I'm going to ask Tim to come up, but before Tim comes up, I just want to thank some other people who made this possible. I want to thank Michael Gately from Columbia, who is here, Ariel Lang, who is not here, but Columbia professors who helped advise Fenway. This partnership with Columbia University is incredible, and we are hoping that we will continue to grow it with your help and support. I also want to thank our board, our staff, past and present, who are here tonight. Again, you can't have a student intern of this curiosity and caliber of intelligence without working with him constantly, and what a pleasure it was for all of us to spend the summer with Fenway. And so I'll make a couple more remarks about Fenway, but I'd really like to invite Tim O'Neill up to thank all of you and the many, I know you're going to have some words for the many donors who created this fellowship with Maggie in mind.
Thank you, Suzanne. I wish I could borrow a lot of those words. We were here a year and a half ago for Maggie's memorial, and it is the thoughtfulness of a bunch of people who have known Maggie since she was born that this thing was really spawned. They came together and decided that pulling together a fellowship to engage in those sort of things around scholarship, civic responsibility, how you take that and move it forward, are so important. I mean, it meant everything to Maggie. It was in her blood, and it's so meaningful to us that it happened. Since then, a lot of other people have jumped on, and we're so grateful to them for their generosity. It is just this great community thing that's happened. Dan and I come to tears. And it's all because of the people in this room and a lot of other people who couldn't make it today. So this is the first. Fenway, look so forward to seeing you. I wish you and Maggie had known each other. You would have gone off in a corner and talked forever, I'm sure. And this is about not just her memory, but really creating this, perpetuating and cementing a lot of those concepts that Suzanne talked about. So thank you, everyone. Take care.
All right, well, I just want to say a few words about Fenway, who is a student at Columbia University, majoring in American Studies, and he joined us this summer for 10 weeks thanks to this really generously funded fellowship. And he chose a fascinating topic, which he's going to share with you today, about land transfers, and to trace back, looking at Rye, what happened when these parcels were passed. And if we look at the politics of land today, that's still a hot topic. And so by researching the past, what can that tell us about what we're doing today with our land development? This place was almost torn down. This was a parcel. In fact, many people look at it as, they still call it the J property, like it's for sale, and it's not, it's protected. We call it the J estate now, but there's a lot to be said for like memory that goes with the land. How do we remember people along with the land? And so that's without stealing your fire, that's a lot about what Fenway's talk is about. And again, I just want to say it has been my pleasure. Meredith Slater, our office manager and assistant program director, the two of us had the chance, many board members, to work with Fenway. His enthusiasm, his passion, his curiosity, his determination to look at every possible source related to his project and vet it. I mean, he was just, you were like burning up the phone lines and the internet. It's like, I need the answer to this, I need the answer to this. And in fact, some of the books, the reference books that he used from our library are outside on a table. The maps are here, but what a pleasure to work with a student of this caliber. And I think I would like to say, I hope and think Maggie I agree with you, would enjoy having a dialogue with Fenway. And we're gonna have a dialogue with Fenway tonight. So Fenway, come up.
Hi, everybody. Following those very kind words, I want to introduce myself. I'm Fenway. I am, welcome to the J. Heritage Center. I'm the inaugural O'Neill Fellow. It has been my absolute pleasure to spend this summer here working with such wonderful people. The JHC team, everyone. I had a fellow intern by the name of Austin who's unable to make it today. He was incredible. Both Suzanne and Meredith and everyone else on the team has just been wonderful. They've been so inviting to me. I want to give a personal thanks to the O'Neill family as well as all their friends who made this possible. This project has been really important to me. I've put a lot of myself into it, and it would not have been possible without the support, the connections to the community, and the just everything that was provided to me this summer. I really appreciate it. As an O'Neill Fellow, I was tasked with learning about how this city's history can teach us about America in general and the shaping of our democracy, which are some really big questions. So we're going to focus on a specific area of that today. We're going to talk about land transfers and land seizures. We're going to look at the first about century of Rye's history. These are not going to be all the answers, nor could I claim to have all them. We're going to look at a small part, think about what that can teach us, and then hopefully spark some more questions that you all can take away and look into as future historians yourselves, I hope, or current historians. I'm honored to have worked with such great historians and dedicated members of the Rye community. I'd like to thank my research advisors, Professor Robert Amder and Professor Lynn Breslin, who have both been, the support they've shown me is just wonderful. They helped guide me through this process. I want to thank Suzanne and Meredith for their kindness and support. Their enthusiasm for my enthusiasm for this work was wonderful, and Suzanne's extensive, incredible knowledge about the J Estate and its history provided a strong foundation for this project. Finally, I'd like to thank my stepfather, Professor Damon Akins, and my mother, who flew in all the way from North Carolina to be here today for my presentation. So I'm going to tell you a story, which we are going to break up into 4 parts. Titled Names, Languages, and Identity, the Rye Purchases, Good Law, and the Doctrine of Discovery, and then this final part about John Jay, the Confiscation Acts, and historical disappearances. We're going to look at 2 moments in history. The initial treaties from 1660 to 1666, and then the Confiscation Acts, which occurred in 1779 through about 1784, 1786. We're going to answer some questions, which is, who owned this land initially that we're standing on? What can we call them, and where are they now? In part 2, we're going to look at how Rye, as we know it, came to be. We're going to look at who might have bought this land and why the people that sold it might have chose to do so. We're going to then look specifically at these treaties, talk about why indigenous peoples' claims to their own land might not have been respected, not by individuals, but by certain legal constructs. And then finally, we're going to compare this to the next major land seizure, the Confiscation Acts, look at how the victims of these confiscation acts were treated, and then see what we can learn from this comparison. For the beginning of this, I want to focus on a land acknowledgement, that we are currently standing on the land of the Wichquozock, a subdivision of the Munsee people. Who are the Munsee? The Munsee as a group can be identified as speakers of the Munsee dialect, which is a dialect of the Lenape language. Lenape or Lenni Lenape might be a familiar term to some of you, or perhaps you've heard of the Delaware, which is another name for the Lenni Lenape that was given to them by early English colonists. It has become a term of self-identification for some in those communities, but it's important to understand the distinction between the name Lenni Lenape and the distinction of the Delaware. One was a term used by these communities, and the other was a term given to them that some have chosen to self-identify with now. The Wichquozock were the historic owners of Rye, as we can see in this map right here, which I'm pulling from an excellent book called The Munsee Indians. We can see it right there where we're standing. Their land extended between the Hudson River and the Long Island Sound, and modern nations such as the Stockbridge Munsee, the Delaware Tribe of Indians, and the Delaware Nation can trace their ancestry directly back to the Munsee people around here. Opening a history book, however, might give you a different idea of who owned this land. I'm using this map as an example, but it's not exclusive to here. Looking at the Westchester Heritage map, this was produced in 1978. And if we look at this land, we can see over here by the Hudson, we have the Wichquozock. However, over towards the Long Island Sound, we see the name Siwanoy. Where does this come from? Well, the Siwanoy can be traced to claims from original Dutch maps made in the 1600s by initial early Dutch colonists and English colonists as well. I'd like to give a special thank you to the town historian of Pelham, Blake A. Bell, who did extensive research about this subject during his tenure from 2005 to 2020 as the town historian. He did so much useful work tracking down where the Siwanoy claim came from. He traces it initially to Robert Bolton's History of Westchester County, which was published in 1848. Bolton does not provide citations for where he finds this, but as far as we can tell, maps like this is where he gets this claim. Each subsequent generation of Rye historians have built upon this claim that the land was Siwanoy land, and all we can find are these maps. These maps were made by people who didn't speak the languages of the people they were describing, who were unfamiliar with the groups of people they were talking about, and we need to take them with about as much grains of salt as we can. We need to look towards actual historical evidence that we can find, which very much says that not only the Munsee and the Wichquozock owned this land and had owned it for hundreds and thousands of years. When we look at where the term Siwanoy, the word might have come from, we can turn to noted anthropologist and Lenape scholar Dr. David Osterreich, who argues that Siwanoy sounded phonetically similar to other words that were used by Munsee tribes to refer to other tribes. So no one in particular, but if you were speaking about another tribe, you might use a word that sounds similar to Siwanoy, which most likely accounts for the origin of why people would think that the people that lived there were referred to as Siwanoy. Just because this name is arbitrary and might not have come from historically these historical roots doesn't mean that Native people haven't taken ownership of it. If you look up Siwanoy today, you can find several tribes that identify as Siwanoy. The emerging consensus that the land was Siwanoy land has led to people who can trace their ancestry all the way back to Rye, all the way back to this time, to identify as Siwanoy. They've taken this identity and made it their own. When we talk about identity, specifically political identity, we're noticing a clash between two forms of political identity. On one hand, there's this, what we've been talking about, where there's a lot of different people who might not have had, who have looser concepts of identity based around shared languages, shared cultures. And on the other hand, we have the European identity of the European concept of political identity. This came from the time of monarchy. Think kings and queens using absolute power over their subjects. They would have known their territory not by shared languages or common culture, but by maps. You could look at discrete and bounded territory, which could change hands during battles or wars, similar to, imagine, if you will, a battle between France and Britain. And the winner of that battle would then claim the territory for them. those people living there are now French, whether they think of themselves as French or not. Colonists entering the New World would have found a very different form of political identity. This is from that same book, The Munsee Indians: A History, which details our rough understanding of the different tribes and identities that would have been present. If you notice, there are not hard and fast boundaries. Not that Native people wouldn't have understood there to be certain territorial claims, but that this has much more to do with a form of identity that might have been unfamiliar to these colonists. This is why during this talk I'm going to refer to tribe, as we can think of it as the purest form of Native identity, despite the fact that Native notions of tribal identity were much more fluid, and that the word tribe might have been the wrong way or the wrong concept for how Native people saw themselves. If we could go back and ask someone from the Weechquazic tribe what they would have, if they identified as Weechquazic, they might not have. They might not have even identified as Munsee, similar to how I don't think anyone in this room goes around identifying as an English speaker in your day-to-day lives. It's just something that you are. While this might feel abstract, imagine in 300 years, a historian looking back at documents of your life, looking back at the purchases you made, the actions that you take, who you voted for, and trying to understand all that, only looking at you as an English speaker. It wouldn't capture why you made the decisions that you made. The Weechquazic themselves might have thought of themselves, as far as we can tell from the documents, as more of a village identity. You, obviously, everyone in this crowd, have lots of different identities. You have your national identity, your state identity, local identities, ethnic and political identities. And when we call people, we call historical subjects by words that didn't make sense to them in their own time, we lose a lot of detail about them. Names and naming, while it might seem a little pedantic, are very important to helping restore agency to our historical subjects, who have often found their own identities defined by other people writing about them. I want to take a moment to check in because we're going to build on this concept a little further. And I can take one or two questions. There's going to be a Q&A afterwards. But if there's any pressing questions about some of these, we're going to build off of this. Yes?
Any idea how many of these Indians were around?
So I don't have exact figures. There is a lot of speculation because a lot of Native cultures used oral history rather than written history as we think of it. We can't go back, say, to documents as we can with like the history of Britain and France and just look at like the King's survey of how many people are in their lands. Anywhere between, the numbers that I've seen seem to be around 20,000 to 40,000. A low estimate is 10 to 15. A high estimate could be anywhere in 100,000.
Is that in Westchester?
This would be the general Munsee population, as well as specifically, when we look at Westchester, we're going to talk about later, when we look at Loyalist lands, the numbers are dropping to like 1,500, 3,000, somewhere in there. So just to know that there is a sharp decrease in population, I think is important to understand. Robert S. Gurmit has more writings about that. I can show you outside after the talk. Yes?
Well, I've understood what you're saying. It sounds like a lot of the history we have of these people is characterized or whatever by the European perspective of people. Is there any historical source that talks about the Native American perspective of the Europeans?
Absolutely.
Their own culture?
Yeah, absolutely. We would look again. There is some written sources that I was able to find in my time. There's an excellent transcription of an oral history of the Stockbridge Munsee Nation taken, I believe, in the mid to late 1700s by someone who was working with the community, detailing their own history. When we look at like Native identity through the lens of like how Native people understood themselves, unfortunately, a lot of that was not written down because it was traced down from different generations telling stories. Oral history, while it may seem unfamiliar to some of us, is very much a valid way of doing history. One of the limitations of my project, unfortunately, was not being able to talk to as many people from these different nations that survive today as I would have liked. I definitely want to do that in the future because, for example, just to do a quick diatribe in the example of like how these sort of facts can come about. If you look at the history of some of these treaties we're going to talk about, you'll see a treaty that occurred on the 11th in 1660. There is no such treaty. If you look at the document, it says 11th month, not 11th day. But in one of these histories, someone in writing about Westchester wrote down the treaty happened on the 11th. And subsequent generations have said, oh, it must have happened on the 11th, pointing back to this book. In an oral culture that's frequently telling these stories, that mistake wouldn't have happened, right? It would have been immediately, someone would have said, that's not true, that never happened, and it would have been corrected. So when we think about like the different ways that these histories would have progressed, we want to look at like both of them as being valid, but playing to different strengths, essentially. I can point you to some excellent resources after the talk. Yeah, I can take one more question.
You say you'd like to have the opportunity to talk to these people. Mm-hmm. Where are they?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. Right now, they've been, unfortunately, I looked specifically at the Stockbridge Munsee Nation as the one. There was a speaker. Yeah, and if anyone was here, actually, for the last talk, Original New Yorkers, we had someone who can trace parts of their heritage from the Stockbridge Munsee Nation. They have been pushed around through a series of, frankly, horrific acts perpetrated by governments, the United States government, all the way from the 1700s to the present day. Right now, some of them are in Wisconsin, some of them have made their home in Oklahoma, and there are certain members, not of the Munsee Nation directly as far as I understand, but for example, the Oneida Nation, who can still claim land in New York right now. And if you wanted to, for example, talk to members of the Lenni Lenape, there's a cultural center in New York. In Manhattan, there's a cultural center here. There's a lot of people that care very deeply about their heritage and their culture that are still able to talk about this today. I'm gonna keep going, but know that we're gonna have another break and then we're gonna get to the end for further questions. So now that we've talked a little bit about who owned the land, I wanna talk about the subject of land itself, the rye purchases. Land in the United States has always been a contentious topic, and colonial New York was definitely no exception. We're gonna look at these land deals from a historical perspective, trying to avoid bringing our knowledge of what New York and Westchester County is to historical documents and maps of what Westchester County was. It's difficult to look at this land, New York, Manhattan, Westchester, and not feel that it's somehow predetermined to be this amazing, beautiful, culturally rich city that we all know. Due in part to its close proximity to New York, due in part to the communities that residents have created over the years, it just feels like Manhattan has to be important. But when we're looking at a time when Manhattan was just another island, when discussing early rye history, it's important to remember that what people in New Netherlands, as the colony at the time, would have been looking for is not real estate value, but shelter, food, protection. How do I make a house? How am I going to eat tomorrow? How do I get back if this doesn't work out? These are the complaints. They're not looking at, in 300 years, this land is going to be super valuable. They have no idea. Trying to attach indigenous names of indigenous groups to contemporary ideas, so like who owned rye, is difficult because rye wasn't a thing. Instead, they understood the land through relational boundaries, so rivers and trees. And if I was to look at these treaties, which I did, you would not see 20 miles east and west. You would see bounded on one end by the Mamaroneck River, bounded on another by the Marked Tree, who knows where that is nowadays, and bounded by the Blind Brook and the ocean. They wouldn't have necessarily called it the Long Island Sound. These boundaries are, of course, flexible and often can claim the same piece of land for multiple people. When we think of town and cities now, you can look at a map to see, like, where does Rye end, where does Mamaroneck begin, where is New Rochelle? That is not a luxury that would have been afforded to either indigenous people or the colonists. So we need to talk about Rye as it was understood in these documents. This is a scary map, but it's okay. We're gonna get through it together. My research focused on two moments, and the first one is the Rye purchases. This was 7 treaties between June of 1660 and June of 1662. In here we see 5. And a final treaty in 1666, which re-legitimized the January 3rd treaty and also gave him 20 miles more. So it was also a treaty for land. It was not just renegotiating terms. These treaties were made by John Budd, who you'll see his name here, through the negotiator Thomas Close, as well as 3 other men, who you'll see: Peter Disbrow, John Coe, and Thomas Stedwell. Disborough, Coe, and Steadwell were buying land on behalf of the authority of Connecticut. They had been vested by a colonial power to buy land to expand that power's territory. John Budd was buying land as a private citizen, which means he was buying it for himself. Not only does this mean that the land was not subject to the same level of governmental control, no one could tell him what to do with his land, and this becomes an issue later, but he might have, under the 1660s understanding, lacked the authority to make these purchases. We're going to talk about that later as well. Since his land deals are somewhat of a historical anomaly, we're going to look at them in more depth as private land sales. First, the issue of naming. Again, when you look at these in history books written between the 1800s and 1900s, you're going to see the Indian deals or the Indian treaties. This is not true. He wasn't buying land from a group of Indians. He was buying land from a specific group of people, and he wasn't even buying from that group. He was buying from a couple of their leaders, specifically Sewenorock, who was a Weechquageck sachem. When we say sachem, we can think of a term similar to leader, who were in Native communities considered in touch with the spirit realm, having demonstrated their leadership abilities prior when the time called for it. And here's the key distinction. They relied on support from their people to maintain their authority through their skill in popular decision making. They would not have understood these inherent claims to power when we think of like kings. Why are you the king? Because God said so. Because my father was the king. Sachems would have demonstrated their abilities to lead when the time called for it. Understanding these purchases, we have to avoid trying to place contemporary values onto historical subjects. We all know what Westchester became. We can read in books about how, for instance, Peter Augustus Jay paid 300 pounds for 400 acres of land, or in 1904, the Jay estate was bought for $300,000, which might make 8 coats, 7 shirts, or 40 pounds seem completely unreasonable. What we're doing there, unfortunately, is we're looking at land only in terms of its monetary value. We're not thinking about why the land purchase would have been made in the 1600s. When I first looked at this and I saw that, I thought they must have been tricked. They must not have understood. Maybe they didn't read the treaty clearly enough. Maybe they weren't understanding what they were doing. But further research shows that assumption is likely false. While each individual treaty was subject to interpretation, historical evidence shows that the Munsee understood the purpose of land deals and were not tricked, as it were, into signing over their documents. You'll see, however, this alternative idea, which has been frequently quoted as "lo the poor Indian," if you've ever heard that term before, the idea that local Native Americans were too ignorant to understand concepts of private property or didn't understand land ownership. I want to point out a particularly egregious example of this from James A. Wood's The Indians of Westchester County, which you can find in the History of Westchester, which I'll be citing a couple times. He says, the one fixed, unchanging, and unchangeable factor in Native Americans' existence, upon which Native Americans could implicitly rely, was the land. And now this was snatched from them from devices through which they were totally ignorant. The term title conveyed no meaning to their understanding. In fact, English, Dutch, and Munsee alike cared deeply about territorial boundaries. We know this because we know not only culturally, the Munsee believed that they were holding their land, current generations were holding it in trust from their ancestors, meaning that they believed they had a duty to their lands, as well as areas like towns, fishing spots, and hunting grounds being held in common, meaning that you had to respect local culture in order to engage with it. You couldn't just walk onto their land and pick food that they were growing. That was their food on their lands. Individual property rights, as we understand them, like the American conception, is very much an idea imported from England, that you have ultimate authority over your lands to do whatever you want. No one can tell you differently, right? We can think of like libertarian ideals. However, the Munsee still very much had a sense of borders and collective ownership, which is evidenced by a series of wars they fought with the Dutch over the Dutch incursions onto their territory. When John Budd and the English began to purchase land from the Munsee, they understood they were setting explicit boundaries and concerned themselves with the transfer and acquisition of natural resources. With this background, we can finally start to look closer at the actual negotiations of these treaties. Here's an example of a treaty with not making you have to read that. Here's what it actually says over there. I had to read that. It's not fun. During the negotiation of these treaties, we can see very clearly that it was for natural resources primarily and for land in the future. This is evidenced by the fact that Nursing Island, which we can see right here, was where the colonists stayed from around 1660 to 1664, even though these deals are being made in 1661, 62, 63. They were buying land and not moving to it. Why? Couple of reasons. They feared for their safety, obviously. It's a new territory that they were incredibly unfamiliar with. They lacked accessible resources, and living on an island gave them the ability to leave to Connecticut were something to go horribly wrong. And they weren't necessarily eager to move to this strange and unfamiliar land, in their view. These lands would have been seen as places to collect natural resources and future destinations. This might help us understand some of these values right here. When we look at, for example, the 80-pound sterling deal, which is the deal that bought the land that would become the Jay Estate and the Marshlands Conservatory, the land that we're on right now. In that treaty, they're spelling out explicitly what natural resources they're buying. So access to trees, access to rivers, access to grazing area for their cattle. Not, we want to definitely build houses here. We're thinking natural resources. Another interesting thing to think about is the dates of these treaties, 1660 to 1666. I talked about how Sewenorock, the Sachem, relied on popular support from his people. It is unlikely, based on my reading of the documents, that these were unpopular decisions among the Wechquoesgeek. It is likely that the deals would have been supported by the people, and that is why Sewenorock's name appears on all of these documents, even 6 years after. If he had been tricked into selling, for example, the island or this area, in 6 years, they would have understood that and replaced him with someone who could make better deals. So why would these deals have been popular? Why would they have been willing to sell their land? Well, for instance, we can think about all of the land they had access to, not just Rye. Selling less valuable land in Rye to maintain control of more valuable land further up the Bronx River could have made perfect sense, as well as the fact that that land might have had other value. For example, it could have been economically important. It could have had political or military value, spiritual significance, or close ties to their identity and heritage. These are all things that can't be expressed as a dollar sign value, but would have been incredibly important when making these deals. In addition, it's unlikely that land so close to the colonists would have been seen as valuable in the eyes of the Wechquoesgeek. Think about it. They just finished fighting a war against the Dutch. Their population had been decimated. The potential for another war, knowing that colonists might in another year or two move back onto their territory they had just fought so hard to defend, might have made it understandable that they wanted to sell land right near the colonists, so this land, and move upstate. In addition, disease plays a huge factor in this. Obviously, European diseases and epidemics, the native people would not have had the natural immunity that colonists would have had, and right around 1660, 1661, we see an outbreak of smallpox that is not documented as well as I would like it to be, to know exactly the effect it had, but it was definitely on the minds of people when they were making these deals. Finally, one more thing that's important. If we look at this map, we'll jump here, you can see that there are larger nations surrounding the Munsee. The Munsee had an incredible ability to play allied native nations against each other to maintain their land and their existence. So, for example, the Five Nations, which if anyone attended the original New Yorkers talk, we learned a little bit about. These are powerful groups of people. The Munsee, the Wechquoesgeek, could not have competed with them militarily, as seen from a series of wars they lost against them. However, they had the ability to play them against each other, understanding who was allied with who, making deals that might have pitted them against each other. It would therefore make sense that selling land to the English after fighting a war with the Dutch, to land that Dutch claimed was theirs, might, in their eyes, have been seen as a way to provoke a conflict between the two of them. They were right about this. If anyone familiar with Rye history knows that Rye was claimed at various times between Connecticut and New York, and that the English fought a war right up to the Dutch and kicked them out of here, said this is our land now. So the Munsee would have been correct in their assumption. Understanding that these factors were native people making rational choices to accommodate the presence of settlers based on their own values makes it so that way, even though these may not make sense to us, it doesn't mean that it didn't make sense to them in their time. We're going to move to the third part of my talk now, which is a closer look at these treaties and the legal understanding that underpins them. I want to once again say that I hope all of you didn't spend your summer trying to decipher stuff like this, which is very difficult. Secondly, and arguably more importantly, we need to acknowledge what makes these treaties different from other treaties in the time period. When we think of a treaty, we think of an agreement between governments, and the existence of the treaty is proof that both governments respect each other as sovereign. No matter how bad the deal and the actual terms of the treaty might be, it's understood that if you're making a treaty with someone, you acknowledge them as a sovereign nation with the power to make that decision. After the American Revolution, for example, treaties between a particular native nation would represent the people, and the US Congress, which would represent the American government. They would come together and make a certain deal. However, for the right purchases, as we remember, they're being made by John Budd, who is a private individual. John Budd does not have the ability to acknowledge the native sovereignty, even if he thought in his head they were a sovereign nation. Legally, it doesn't matter what he thought, which means that when the Wieckazek were making these treaties, they were being given promises of payment, but they were not given guarantees of rights. They were not being given forms of recourse if the treaty was violated, and their sovereignty wasn't upheld in a way that treaties with, if we look back here, treaties with here, like Peter Disbrow, John Coe, and Thomas Stedwell, would have acknowledged to a certain extent the sovereignty of the people to make that deal. As well as when we look at the idea of self-interest as fueling these deals, we can understand that Native people made rational decisions. However, they were fighting against a legal framework that did not acknowledge their ability to own their own land. It wasn't ignorance, it wasn't trickery, and it wasn't even racism, as we think of it, that prevented them from making these land claims. Rather, it is the doctrine of discovery. This is an important legal concept, so we're going to spend some time on this to make sure. This is the legal foundation of large parts of Britain and America's claim to ownership in the newly created colonies, as well as the Dutch, as well as Spain. It is considered good law, which means it has not been overturned today. This is still good law in terms of how we presently understand our property rights. The doctrine was established with the papal bulls in the 16th century, and it was summarized in 1823 by Justice John Marshall, who wrote in Johnson and Graham's Leases versus McIntosh that the Indian inhabitants are to be considered merely as occupants, to be protected indeed while at peace in the possession of their lands, but to be deemed incapable of transferring their absolute title to others. This is 1823. Long time ago. However, this case was most recently cited in 2005 by Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg in the case City of Sherrill versus Oneida Nation, Indian Nation of New York, in which she says, under the doctrine of discovery, title to the land occupied by Indians when the colonists arrived became vested in the sovereign. The sovereign was first the discovering European nation, and then later the original states and the United States. Our legal understanding is that when the Revolutionary War happened, all claims to land from those other nations were transferred to America by nature of America winning the Revolutionary War. Britain couldn't make land claims onto territory that they had lost a war over. When we discuss the doctrine of discovery, we're not discussing an antiquated historical idea. We're discussing part of the current basis of American property law. This is a lot to handle. What does this all mean? I want to turn to Edward Floyd de Lacy's book, Origin of History of Manors and Provinces in New York and the County of Westchester, which is a real mouthful, which gives a succinct definition of the relevant parts of the doctrine to our talk today. He says, and I'm going to take my jacket off before this because it is hot, that Native nations were recognized as rightful occupants, but their power to dispose of the soil at their own will to whomsoever they pleased was denied by the original fundamental principle of discovery that gave exclusive title to those who made that. He describes how natives had no power to sell their lands to private individuals or other governments, and that the nation that discovered or conquered the land was the one who held ultimate authority. You can sell your house if you want to. You can do it at any time. It's yours. Under this property understanding, they had no ability to sell the lands they lived on. They could only live on them. Native sovereignty would have been considered a contradiction in terms because the tenets of this doctrine didn't recognize the Native people's ability to own the land they lived on. So explicitly to clarify, the title and ownership of land under the doctrine of discovery was not able to be sold by colonists. It was held by the nation that discovered the land, and the indigenous people were simply inhabitants of the land. This would have been considered enshrined in law. So think about this. If Native people found themselves in conflict with the government that discovered their lands, they couldn't do a lot about it because the government would say, we have claim to this land. So when we look at John Budd's land claims, this is a document I found in the Westchester County Archives. It's about 1720. I have labeled the Mamaroneck River here, Long Island Sound, Blind Brook, Boston Post Road, so you get a sense of what we're talking about. When we're looking at his claim to his land, he bought this during a time that it was unclear how exactly Native people could sell their land if they wanted to. By the time of the 1700s, think 1760 or even during the American Revolution, when this doctrine is being codified into law, he's already owned this land for 100 years. No one's going to take it from him. He has passed it not only to his son, but to his grandson. He's a valued member of the Rye community. The finer points of this doctrine wouldn't have been necessary to enforce because this land was sold 100 years ago. It's not going to be necessarily they're not going to go through these treaties word by word and understand exactly what happened. The deals had already been made. When we overlay this over the map of Westchester or of Rye that I've been working with, we can see exactly where that land is. And it's important to understand that when we look at this framework, it's still in practice today. This is not a historical idea that's been supplanted by better law. We have one part of this talk left. That was a lot of legal history. I understand. I would love to open the floor again for a question or two to clarify some of the points before we talk about the Confiscation Act and compare this to another famous land seizure in Rye. Yes?
If the Indians didn't own their land, how could the owner buy it?
So this is a really interesting question, which is John Budd in court. There's documents in 1720 of him defending his ability to own this land. That the Rye court in 1720, when he incorporated his land into Rye, said this land was purchased validly. I don't have those documents because they don't exist anymore. There is just a record of minutes, which is actually at the Rye Historical Society. It's these big bound books, volumes 1 through 4, in which it says there were complaints about the land. John Budd successfully defended these complaints and owns the land. I don't know how he did that. I would love to know how he did that, but it is my understanding is that there do exist historical documents that I would love to see about this, but this is not considered an open question, right? This has been settled in 1720 during during these initial trials in colonial land. I would love to know more about the specifics. In my 10 weeks, I unfortunately didn't have enough time to go deep into this question. I would love to. If someone is so inspired and you find out, please let me know. My email will be somewhere on their website, and please do tell me. But in terms of the legal specifics, I'm unfamiliar with. I just know that there were court cases that vindicated his claim to the land. I can take one more question.
Is it, and you might not have any, I don't know if you know or not, how typical is this that there was both a private individual buying land at the same time that a state or a governor from England might have been trying to buy this land?
So I'm going to speak from sort of a place of ignorance here, where I know some, but not all United States history, unfortunately. This is not an uncommon phenomena that individuals are racing ahead of states to purchase land, right? You can think about this is much later, but people going out and trying to buy land that they knew railroads were going to develop on, so that way they would have to sell, the railroads have to buy land from them rather than trying to buy it from a state. This is a pretty common phenomenon in American history. Think about westward expansion, right? There's all of this land that the government is making a claim to, but also private individuals who are trying to get out ahead of it and make that claim. So instead of negotiating with native nations, they're negotiating with someone who wants money for the land. In terms of specifics with New York, I believe that there's other examples of private individuals buying this. I want to say that I heard about something in upstate. There's this thing called lame wills purchase, which I don't have time to get into. This is sort of later, but it's got a similar thing in which a private individual buys land, then the government of Rye says we own that land, and then there's a series of court cases on who owns it. So it's not an unfamiliar thing, but in terms of Rye history, it's something that's unique. We're gonna go to the fourth and final part. I appreciate you all for sticking with me through here. So we're gonna talk about the doctrine of discovery now. So to understand the doctrine of discovery, we're gonna talk about the Confiscation Act. The Confiscation Act is the second large transfer of land in Rye history. Nothing on this scale had happened before outside of the Rye purchases. This was the seizure of Loyalist land during and after the American Revolution that was sparked in 1779 by the New York's passage of the Act of Attainder or Confiscation Act. This is a document that, as far as I can tell, exists in Albany. I can't go to Albany, so we're gonna have to settle with this screenshot from their website. The Confiscation Act made it a crime to hold property in the state of New York and adhere to the British king. Not to be treasonous, because treason can only be prosecuted as someone who's sworn loyalty to a country, but adhering to the British king means that this law can apply to British subjects and their land who would not say that they're American citizens. Far from it, they would say they're British citizens. This meant that it could be used to punish people, not only American citizens, but British people that were still in the land fighting against America during the Revolution. It banished a series of individuals you can see named here, former governors of the colony, William Tyrone, John Murray, and a long list of names, as well as setting out procedures on how to find other people guilty not named in the law. Think about the fact that we don't do this anymore. You can't just write a law and say someone's guilty. We'll get to that. So it sets out these procedures for trying people, and it says that anyone tried can't be banished, but anyone named in the law, you're gone, you're done. If you come back here, it's capital punishment, which meant that they couldn't keep their lands, obviously. It also sets up definitions of crimes that can result in land seizures. So, for example, having a son that fights for the British means that their family can get their land taken. It wasn't just you. You could be convicted by a single witness who hadn't seen you do something directly and didn't even know if you owned land or not. It set up committees to sell this land so that way they could finance the war effort and move the burden of raising funds for the war off of patriots onto loyalists. The Confiscation Act also seized every single piece of land held by the British Crown within New York, because of course it did. The Confiscation Act was unconstitutional so egregiously at a time where we didn't even have a concept of the US Constitution. This goes against every single one of our founding principles as a nation. Many of the founding fathers, specifically John Jay, did not like this very much. Here's an example of a conviction under the Confiscation Act. Well, something I want to point out here is that it's a fill-in-the-blank form where you just say, who is it, what's the date, what did they do? It doesn't even say necessarily what they did. It's just like, here's all their land, and we're taking it signed by a judge, right? This isn't how we do things nowadays. Back to the Confiscation Act's unconstitutionality. It removes the right to trial, right, which is a deeply held right by all American citizens. It declares people legally guilty without presenting compelling evidence that they committed any crime. It allows testimony based on a single witness who doesn't know anything about the property. We can look at the writings of John Jay himself to realize how insane this law was. When writing to Governor George Clinton at the time, he's negotiating treaties at the time to try to end the Revolutionary War. He sees this printed in a British newspaper in 1780, and he says, if truly printed, New York is disgraced by injustice too palpable to admit even on palliation. I feel for the honor of my country, and therefore beg the favor of you to send me a true copy of this law. If the other be false, I may, by publishing yours, remove the prejudices against you. John Jay's thinking about the perception of America abroad. This is during the Revolution. Laws like this that are seizing land would not only have been unpopular at home, but might have removed some of America's claim abroad that they're fighting for the individual rights of people, right? We think about the shaping of democracy. It starts before America's a thing. Surprisingly and unsurprisingly, for a family like the Jays that were so influential in New York politics, they also were influential in the passing of this bill. John Jay had previously supported an amendment to the state constitution that permits bills of attainder, which means when you pass a law declaring someone guilty without trying them. John Jay is the reason this finds its way into the Constitution, as well as one of the most outspoken critics of the law itself. James' brother, Sir James Jay, had helped push an earlier failed version of this law through the Senate where it failed in the House. The purpose of this law is twofold, right? It not only punishes loyalists for not supporting the revolution, but it also prevents them from using their property to support the British war effort. Since New York is, during British occupation, this would have been a huge deal to them. They don't want people directly abiding troops that, in the eyes of America, are here illegally. When we look at people that are having their land seized, we're going to look at yeomen and farmers, and we can think of for example, blacksmiths and fishers and other like normal professions. There's examples we'll talk to in a second about huge land seizures, but these are also coming from people like us who are just sort of like, you're going to your day-to-day job, suddenly you find out there's suspicion that you're for the British, and then New York has taken your land and is selling it to support the war effort. Westchester County especially is a hotbed of loyalist sentiment. It's a very divided community between patriots and loyalists. Many chose to remain neutral, which in the eyes of the New York government could have been as bad as supporting the British cause. They couldn't seize the land in 1779. They had to wait until 1784, until the war was won, to go back and retroactively take a lot of land from people, which was then sold to pay off New York's war debts. Looking at a famous example of this, the Phillipsburg Manor, which you might be familiar with. This map was created in the 1880s, and then later a version of it in the 1900s, which shows, if you can see those faint lines, it's being broken up into small little chunks and auctioned off. This huge manor is being sold off piecemeal by the government to pay for the war effort. Why the Phillipsburg mansion in particular? It would have been a strong political symbol. If anyone here is familiar with the Phillipsburg Proclamation of 1779, it's a famous proclamation. It's one of the two during the Revolution that says that American slaves will be free if they escape to British lines. The Phillipsburg Proclamation is especially interesting because it does not have any guarantees of service attached, meaning that if you were an enslaved person and you escaped across land, you were free without having to fight for the British or support them in any way. This made a lot of American slaveholding patriots very angry, and it would make sense that the Phillipsburg Manor would have been top priority to serve as a reminder that property, whether defined as land or people, was paramount in the newly formed American nation. It's uncomfortable to think of property as not just land, but we need to think about it how people would have thought about it at the time. When we think about the threat of property seizure in Rye specifically, we can look to General Worcester, who was an American general who required families to leave their houses unless their husbands returned from fighting with the British. He had a list. He knew which families were fighting for the British. He issues an ultimatum in 1780 that says, if you do not stay home and leave the British ranks, we will kick your children and your wives out of their houses. We will send them to New Rochelle or Pelham to the poorhouses. That is not current. I don't mean that in a way, I'm just reading the documents. When families are stripped from this is a huge deal, to strip a family of property while the soldiers there couldn't defend them. This led to a mass desertion from British forces. When people come back, they would have seen these acts in the newspapers. Also, Mamaroneck is important. The poorhouses are also in Mamaroneck. It's in the document. As to how the law directly affected Rye, turning back to it, local committees would elect these things called committees of safety. What the committees of safety did was they served as provincial governments during the war. We know this is important because there was mass exodus from New York during the war. You can't hold a quorum, you can't make legal decisions when too few people are actually there. How do we know too few people were actually there? Well, there's a gap in the town hall meeting of Rye from April 7th, 1772 to April 1st, 1783, which if you look at the minutes, there's a note that says, the war coming on and put the town in such great confusion that many of the principled people left their habitation, that no law could take place amongst them until this time. Meaning like, sorry, we left, we'll come back, and we're taking it. However, there's a danger in taking historical sources at their word. People writing about themselves don't often tell you they've done things that are bad. The Slater files on hold at the Rye Historical Society's archives reference a meeting in 1776 made by this committee from the principal people who apparently left. We don't have archival documented evidence of this meeting besides the fact that it happened, but it suggests that the people in Rye are meeting, electing officials, seizing land, and passing laws during the war, but they're not recording it, which is unfortunate for me and could have been potentially incredibly dangerous for people during that time. You wouldn't have a record of if they were even looking into seizing your land. Even while actively fighting for the British. This is an important point, so this is the final point that I really want to make, but I really want to make it important. Even while actively fighting for the British, loyalists were allowed certain rights that the Wheatcrouzet were never afforded because loyalists were American citizens. Loyalists remained citizens. This law did not strip them of citizenship, unless you were banished, of course, in which you were. But the ones that were convicted remained citizens. They were given notice, oftentimes, of land seizures. They were sometimes able to argue their innocence in front of the courts, and they afterwards could receive restitution in the form of 25% of the land sale back from the state government once the Constitution is passed and bills of attainder are ruled unconstitutional. Loyalists had avenues to fight these land seizures. Native Americans, by contrast, were not citizens. They did not share in the rights of Englishmen during the right purchases. In fact, at the time of the Revolutionary War, they would not be citizens for 145 more years. Until the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, Native people were not recognized at birth as American citizens, as many of us take the privilege for granted of, despite being subject to America's laws. Rather, in order to become citizens, they would have to be naturalized and give up their tribal citizenship, which would have been very important to many of these nations. And even then, even after becoming naturalized citizen, their voting rights and their civil liberties were not often protected. When we look at these two moments in Rye history, we see how the legal basis for the doctrine of discovery shaped Rye's history, how it's provided us with clear examples of fundamental inequalities that are baked into modern property law. It's important once again to state these are not individual bad actors. This is a system that does not recognize Native people's claims to their own land. They didn't have the claims that Bud and the other Rye people would have in their ability to dispose of the land how they wanted. Some of this can be explained by the unequal legal structure, but not all of it. This is not simply a story about inequalities in the law, it's also about inequalities in perception. When loyalists actively raised arms against their own country, you'd be hard-pressed to find people that believe that loyalists vanished in New York after 1783. We assume that some fled to Canada or other places that would have been friendly, but most continued without their lands, doing what they were doing and recovering their lands for their lives and their families, right? They moved on. However, without their land, we often assume that Native people simply ceased to exist, vanishing from our minds and from the history books. But they're not gone. By imagining the Witch-Kuzek as gone, we actively engage in the process of erasing them. Alternatively, by properly naming the Witch-Kuzek and acknowledging their history, we return agency to a people that have found themselves written out of our history books. As Bonnie Hartley, the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Stockbridge-Munsee Nation, said in an interview with Westchester Magazine, most people think we're dead and gone. She goes on to describe how people from the Munsee tribes continue to journey to their ancestral homelands in New York from their reservations, how they strive to protect and preserve their lands from development and destruction. She explains how the tribe is thriving and continuing their advocacy work to make sure their culture and history isn't lost. She says, we've come a long way from the devastation that occurred after European contact. It's really a remarkable story that we exist at all. Unfortunately, this is not just a story about the Witch-Kuzek. Displacement and erasure from memory remains a challenge to all communities, no matter their ethnicity. Land transfers remain unevenly exchanged and historically misunderstood. The research I've done this summer uncovers a small part of Rye's story, one that needs attention, but there's other stories too that are worth telling. From the teardown of mom and pop shops to gentrification of historically black neighborhoods, communities can often find themselves forced out of stories they helped write themselves. By acknowledging their vital contributions, imprints, narratives, and names, we can better preserve and understand our shared heritage. Thank you so much for your time, and I'll now open the floor to any questions. Thank you so much. Oh, yeah, please.
All right, but before we take questions, again, a round of applause I wanted to say for Professor Donegan. Right?
Maybe one day.
I want to acknowledge our New York State Assemblyman Steve Otis in the back, who also who said that everyone in this room is going to get credit. Everyone gets you all get
It goes on your
credit.
transcripts, don't worry.
You all get course credit tonight. All right, now we'll take some questions.
Thank you all so much. Yes.
Fenway, bravo. Blown away, dude.
Thank you.
Incredible. Kudos to you for taking a massive body of work and distilling it and shepherding it through a very interesting talk. I have three things I want to ask you about.
Absolutely.
Quick hits.
You only get one.
We can do quick. We can do quick.
I'll propose 3 quick hits. You handle them how you'd like.
Got it.
Could you please talk about your background geographically, where you grew up, what brought you to Columbia, and then why Rye as your project for the summer, and then what now with what you've done?
Okay, I'll do the third one last, definitely. So I have time to think about it. I was born in Texas, and I moved to North Carolina when I was 4 years old, and I've been there until Columbia. The opportunity to come to New York to do historical research and study in such a famous place with such a well-documented history I couldn't pass it up. The ability to study in Manhattan with amazing professors, people that are at the top of their field, to walk into rooms with people who have done work that I'm citing in my papers, to do work with people that just blow me away in every conversation it was too good to pass up. I did not expect to go to Columbia. That was absolutely not the plan. I was prepared very much to stay in state, to go to there's great schools in North Carolina, right? We think UNCG, we think UNC Chapel Hill, Davidson, et cetera. Guilford College, which is where Professor Damon Akins teaches. And the ability to go to Columbia it was too good to pass up. What's next is a huge question. There's a lot of further work in here that needs to be done. There's a lot of deals in land transfers and loyalists. The idea of land as a historical concept is something I would love to explore further in thesis work. I'm going to be writing a thesis in a year for my senior project. So I'll have to think about that. There's a lot of stuff I would like to do here, but obviously New York has such a rich and varied history that like anything else that catches my eye is absolutely, I can just go there. Why Rye? It's a really interesting question. Rye has such a fascinating, well-documented history. The Westchester County Archives and the Rye Historical Society are 2 fascinating places that I highly recommend visiting if you have any interest whatsoever. The librarians that work there are exceptional, top of their class. I would just email them and say, I'm interested in the Confiscation Act. I get an email back like, here's every single document we have of it, how can I help? Which is a little much, but like online resources are amazing. And Columbia had a recent partnership with the JHC, and they were looking for someone who was interested in Rye history, who was interested in doing work that focused not only on history but social justice and talking about potentially marginalized communities. And it was the work I wanted to do. Yeah. Thank you.
If we have no more questions, we are going to adjourn to the cocktail area and the veranda. And thank you again all so much for coming. We hope to continue this work. Again, Nan, Tim, all the people who supported this fellowship. Fenway, kudos to you. I mean, again, like the energy and the curiosity is boundless. And if you want to come back and do more work, we're here.
Absolutely.
Okay.
As a final thing, really quickly, I want to say I have a written up version of this talk as well as my research summary, which is about 40 pages long. It's a little denser than this, but it has like a citations list if you're curious about some of the claims that I make, if you want to look at these documents themselves, as well as locations of where to find them. That will be on the website for the J Heritage Center, as well as this talk in recorded form if you want to come back to anything. And I'm happy, my information will be there. I'm happy to answer any questions later if they come up. I'm happy to do. I am so interested in this, and I want to work with you if you have any other questions. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it.